Sounds great. Thank you. Just bear with me for one moment while I pull up my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint, hopefully?
Yep.
Wonderful. Since I'm only using one monitor, if you're, like you said, if there's any questions or if you guys need to flag anything for me, please feel free to do so verbally because I'm going to be looking at the PowerPoint. But good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Tania Bougebrayel Cohn. I use she, her pronouns. I work in the Department of Public Safety, Communications, and Emergency Management, Arlington County, or just emergency management. I work predominantly in communications and public engagement. So a lot of what I do is what I'm doing today. I'm out in the community talking about resilience, emergency preparedness, things that you can do to make your household more prepared for an emergency. Today, we're going to do just that. We're going to go through some tips for older adults that can help you prepare for an emergency. And click through my next slide. We're going to talk first a little bit about what we do, what my department does in emergency management. We'll talk about identifying an emergency, how you do that versus a non-urgent situation. And I'll walk you through 3 simple preparedness steps that you can take today to help you be prepared for an emergency in your household, in your organization, even in your workplace. And those steps, first one is being informed and knowing who to call. The second step is making an emergency plan and practicing. And the third step is gathering supplies and building an emergency kit. And then once we go through all of that, we will go ahead and talk about some additional emergency considerations, other things that you can think about. And then we'll end, of course, with Q&A. That being said, as Gary was saying, if you have any questions at all during my presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and we'll answer it accordingly. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, what do emergency managers do? Believe it or not, this is a question that I like to ask a lot of folks, and I get so many different answers. So a lot of folks think, okay, an emergency manager is involved in a huge disaster, something like a flood or something very significant that could impact multiple people, potentially loss of lives, loss of resources, facilities, etc. And that is true. A lot of what emergency managers do is, and a lot of times when you physically see us, it is when there's an incident that's large and it has multiple parts and requires additional resources other than first responders. But we do a lot more than that. We are not just involved with emergency response, but also emergency preparedness, like what we're doing today, mitigation, making sure the disaster does not have as drastic of an impact as it could. And then, of course, the rebuilding process as well after a disaster. So an example I like to give is imagine a single vehicle, and let's say that single vehicle gets into a collision. There are no injuries. There's really no damage. And most likely the people that would be involved would be first responders, maybe police, maybe if needed, maybe fire or EMS, but likely just police, maybe an insurance company. Now let's take that same vehicle. Let's say it's involved with another vehicle collision. And let's say they hit a telephone pole and which falls on a building that's got apartments and a restaurant in it. And let's say a fire breaks out. That simple collision has now turned into a larger event with cascading impacts. It's a lot more nuanced. So if you think about who might be involved in that kind of a response, you've got fire, EMS, you've got police, of course. Since there is a utility outage, you've probably got our Department of Environmental Services who's trying to restore, make sure the street's closed, make sure that everyone is safe and knows to avoid that area. We might have external folks like Dominion Energy, for example, who would be involved in trying to restore power. If there are the residents in the building need to be rehoused, our Department of Human Services and some of our nonprofit partners might get involved to find shelter for those, temporary shelter for those that need to be removed due to the fire. So as you can see that event, and these are just a few off the top of my head, but the event gets larger and larger when you think about it. And that's where an emergency manager comes into play. Specifically, they would come into that sort of an emergency and they do a couple things. First, they'd gather the facts. They would connect all of those people and organizations that I mentioned, because there's a lot of them. They would manage the information that's being shared, the resources, and the consequences of any choices made. They would keep everyone in constant communication. This is especially important when decisions are being made by leadership. So whether they're being made by our county manager or our executive team, we are the ones that translate that to the boots on the ground folks. So our EMS, our first responders, et cetera. We most importantly want to restore a sense of order and safety as quickly as possible. And lastly, we always joke that we like to turn chaos into organizations. We are self-proclaimed chaos coordinators because we will come into a situation and try to find resolve and get it remedied as quickly and safely as possible. And the slide I shared before, there's some of the things that we do as emergency managers. In the top left corner, you'll see what I believe is either a vaccination or COVID testing site. Starting in 2020, March of 2020, the Department of Emergency Management teamed up with our public health division. And together we were the ones handling the COVID response in Arlington County. And that included things like bringing testing sites and vaccination clinics to neighborhoods most in need. We're also in charge of a lot of the supplies and the items that you would need during an emergency. So for example, that middle top photo, you see our logistics team. They had all the PPE, the gowns, the masks, the hand sanitizers, all of those items that were needed during COVID-19. They were stored in our warehouse and delivered by our warehouse team. And then there's some of the more traditional roles that we take on after a disaster, like providing food, shelter, water, and supplies. So I want to talk a little bit about what do you think constitutes an emergency? And I want to ask everyone, so feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. So anyone, what do you guys think makes an emergency? What is an emergency? And there are no wrong answers here. Anyone?
Are threatened.
I'm sorry, one more time.
When lives are threatened.
When lives are threatened. Okay. That's very true. What else?
You can have a traffic emergency. So when people's ability to do their normal everyday business is threatened.
Absolutely.
Traffic emergency. We have things in the chat. Storm and floods, loss of electricity due to tree down, and floods again. This is Arlington. Floods are big.
That's a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about. Now, those are all great answers. When we talk about an emergency, we usually refer to something that's sudden, unexpected, requires immediate attention because of loss of property, damage, lives, etc. And the reason why we start and ask this question is because there are situations that constitute an emergency, and there are others that don't. So we like to kind of get this conversation started because part of what our team does is provide education on when to call 911 and when you should seek other resources. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about important phone numbers, but all those answers are absolutely correct. And especially in reference to the biggest hazards we face in Arlington, which tend to be storm related. So now I'm going to ask everyone, what do you do to prepare for an emergency? Is there anything you guys do? You guys know the storm coming.
Candles and flashlights with fresh batteries.
That's a good one. Candles, flashlights, fresh batteries.
Bottled water.
Water. That's a big one.
Go kit.
Go kit. Okay. All right. I see someone's going to help me teach this a little later. I like it. Anything else?
Prayers.
Prayers. Okay.
Oh, and Wendy's saying charge the electronics, keep devices, batteries topped off. Oh, and prescription drugs.
That's the big one. Medicine. Yeah, those are all great answers. So there's a lot of different ways that you can prepare for an emergency. There's so many things. You guys mentioned so many great answers and choices right off the top of the conversation. We always present preparedness in kind of 3 simple steps. And we do this to kind of help you just kind of think about it in an easy, I can do this today at home, this evening with my family, my household, and kind of have that outlook as you prepare for an emergency. So the first step is being informed and knowing who to call. The second step is making an emergency plan and practicing. And the third step is gathering supplies and building an emergency kit. I heard you guys mention a few supplies, flashlights, batteries, water, etc. I heard even someone mention a go kit. So we're going to talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. So the first step to being prepared is being informed and knowing who to call. Emergencies can happen at any time and with little to no notice. So it's really important to do your best to be prepared for one. And a great way to do that is to be informed. Being informed, let me go to my next slide. There are several ways that you can be informed. The first and foremost, you guys already touched on this. I think you can teach this presentation yourself, which is, I'm glad to hear that. Know your risk. A few folks mentioned rain, flooding, because that's a really important thing that happens in Arlington. So when I talk about know your risk, I mean what emergencies are likely to happen in your neighborhood or potentially your household. In Arlington County, when we speak of hazards, meaning natural hazards that could impact us, we always are generally talking about heavy rainstorms, severe flooding and stormwater, et cetera. We also talk about inclement winter weather, like heavy snowfall, et cetera. So those are our big ones. And the reason why that's important is because you can prepare accordingly when it comes to those types of potential emergencies versus, for example, I'll say, California, where they're a lot more susceptible to earthquakes, for example, or in Hawaii, where they're more susceptible to volcanic explosions, right? Or even further down south, we still get some hurricanes being on the coast, but obviously if you live in Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, you're probably always thinking about hurricanes coming through because that's a natural hazard in your area. So knowing your risk can really help you because it'll help you identify how to prepare. I also can say know your risk in your household, right? So if there's certain health issues that you might have or your partner or other members in your household might have, just being aware of what those symptoms, what those signs might be to look for just in case an emergency does happen. Being informed also means having multiple reliable ways to have information. The little picture right here, your cell phone. A lot of us probably use our cell phones for so many things these days, to get the news, to get updates, to talk to family, to talk to friends. But there's other ways that you can receive information. On my slide right here, I had a TV news. If you still watch cable TV or satellite TV, radios are a great way to receive information. The image of the radio that I have on screen is actually a crank radio, which means it doesn't require batteries. I found this, I have one personally in my home in my emergency kit. It cost me about $17, I believe, from Amazon. It's solar powered, so I can take it out, put it in the sunlight if I'm at home, and I can also use the little crank lever, and that charges it to work as a radio as well as a flashlight. And what I love about it is there's also a little USB plug, so in case our cell phones die, and we're unable to charge them, this is another way to charge them that does not require batteries. We can just crank. So many ways to get information. Obviously, there's the radio stations. We were talking about that a little earlier. There's a lot of online sources. So we always suggest you follow us on, if you're on social media, things like Facebook. I believe it's called X now. It's no longer called Twitter, but I know a lot of folks do receive their updates from social media. So you're welcome to follow us, the county, police, fire, the Weather Channel. So there's really kind of an endless ways that you can be informed and have a reliable ways to receive information. I always like to stress this too, especially for older adults, the importance of a trusted buddy system. Whether it's someone in your household, your neighbor, your friend, whether it's a community like you guys have here with ANV, having some sort of resource that you can share information with, that you can go to, that you know is reliable, is very helpful. We found this especially when COVID was really heavy in early 2020. We found that our neighborhood community organizations and our community partners were really the ones that were getting information to everyone who needed it the most. So there really is an importance of having a trusted buddy system. And it's not just for older adults. I'll talk about this a little bit later. One of my emergency points of contact happens to be my neighbor because they're part of my trusted buddy system. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then lastly, when it comes to being informed, is you want to make sure that you follow the guidance of reliable expert sources. For example, if officials tell you to shelter in place or evacuate, follow their orders. You want to make sure you're listening to, and when I say officials, I mean like county officials, emergency responders. You just want to make sure that you're listening to the subject matter experts. And a lot of times when there's an emergency, there will be sometimes conflicting messaging because it's a very dynamic, rapidly changing situation. So what we always suggest is just ask, go to our website, follow, check, send an email to us if you're concerned, call the non-emergency line. There's so many ways that you can get subject matter experts weighing in and giving you reliable information if you're unsure what to do. So I always got to plug Arlington Alert. If you're not familiar with Arlington Alert, it is our free emergency alert system that we offer in the county. You only need one option. You can use your cell phone, your landline, your email. You don't need to have all three. If you want to, you're welcome to. You go to arlingtonalert.com. Or you could scan this QR code. At the end of my presentation, I'll also drop my email in the chat. So if you're having any issues signing up for Arlington Alert and need help, just let me know. I'm happy to walk you through it. It takes about 5 to 6 minutes to set up a profile. But once you do, you basically plug in your address and it'll notify you. For me, I have my settings to my cell phone, so it'll notify me by text message anytime there's an alert happening in my area. So I'll give you guys a couple examples. Over the summer, we had a lot of issues with air quality in Arlington due to some fires in Canada. So anytime there was a code red, a code orange, I was getting a message sent to my phone saying, hey, heads up, the air quality isn't great today, which is great because I tend to have lung issues and I'm immunocompromised. So that was an immediate, okay, I'm going to try to stay home today. And if I need to go outside, I'm going to wear my mask. So that was very helpful. I also happen to live in an area that's at the bottom of the hill, which is a flood zone. So anytime that there's heavy rainfall or a flash flood, I immediately get a flash flood warning, and it lets me know, hey, be careful, check your surroundings, etc. As I said, it's free. We do not spam you. We just send you alerts as they come up, as they're urgent or as they're related to weather, traffic, or other emergencies. So as I said, you only need one. And if you have any questions on how to set it up, I'm happy to walk you through it, offline, and I'll share my email address as well. So another way that you can be prepared, I said the first step is being informed, but also knowing who to call and writing down important phone numbers. We're going to walk through three different types of numbers you should have, be familiar with and or write down. The first, I'm guessing everyone knows this one, 911, but we'll talk about some tips and how to text 911. Arlington phone numbers, these are also non-urgent numbers. We'll talk about that. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, not all situations are necessarily require you to call 911. So we'll talk about what situations might require non-urgent numbers. And then lastly, and this one's my personal favorite, and I think the most important, is your specific contacts and phone numbers. So let's talk through that. First, if there's ever an emergency, if you're ever in doubt, I always tell folks, when in doubt, do not hesitate, call 911. There's a few things to know, obviously, as I mentioned, when you should call 911. I always give the example when I'm in the communities and I'm giving these presentations. I say, if your neighbor is annoying you because they're being loud, does that warrant you calling 911? And believe it or not, I've had a few people say, yes, my sleep is important. And while that is true, that is not a situation that would require police to be there. You can actually report that using the non-emergency line. But obviously things like, let's say you're having trouble breathing or you smell smoke, those are immediate situations where you need to call 911. Knowing your address, and if you're outside, being able to identify what street you're on or what's a nearby landmark. A lot of us in Arlington County may live in multifamily buildings, meaning we live in a condo or an apartment. You want to be able to give that specific number as well. Even though our phones do locate us, if you think about it, like I live in a building with about 30 other units in my specific condo. So I need to tell them exactly where to go to find me, not just my address. Staying calm, always important, knowing the emergency, being able to describe it, being ready to answer questions and follow directions. The emergency responder on the other end of the line, the telecommunicator, they're going to guide you through. They're going to ask you a lot of questions. And their goal is to keep you calm and make sure that they can get the resources that you need to you as quickly as possible. Don't hang up. If you hang up, they will call you back. We want to make sure that we try to eliminate any sort of issues. And then if you have any children in the household, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, etc., just educate them on the importance of calling 911 and that it's not a prank. We don't ever want to hold up the lines for a prank or for kids playing around. In Arlington and the greater DC metro area, if you cannot call 911, we always recommend that you text 911. This is especially important if you're unable to speak or if it's dangerous to talk. So in the little image of the screen over here of the cell phone grab, this person is texting that they're in their basement, there's an intruder in their house, and they sent their address. Obviously, anytime that you can speak to someone on the phone, you can give them more details, that's ideal, but this exists should you not be able to do so. You just want to make sure that you tell them what the emergency is and your address. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that in some situations, the neighbor being noisy, for example, not all situations warrant you calling 911. And the reason why I recommend having important county numbers or even other vendors that you might use in the area is because sometimes it's actually a lot faster, more efficient, and it's easier for everyone to call those numbers directly. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, our 911 center, I don't know if I did mention this actually, the statistic, but last year, between April of last year and April of this year, our 911 center received about just over 250,000 emergency calls, 911 calls. And believe it or not, they also received almost the same amount of calls in non-urgent numbers. So that went to the non-emergency line. That's a lot. That's over 500,000 calls in about a course of a year. And those are answered by our first responders, by our telecommunicators. So we encourage you, if you have questions or if there's a situation that's non-urgent, to use the other phone numbers, to use the things online like our report a problem, if you guys are familiar with that. That's on our county website. So anytime you see a fallen tree branch, we recommend you actually go immediately into that portal, put in the address. Our Department of Environmental Services will actually come out and fix the problem almost quicker than if you were to try to call our non-emergency line. So these numbers will vary depending on the needs of your household. An example that I like to give: in my condo that I live in, we're instructed anytime that we smell gas, we're not to call 911. We're actually meant to call Washington Gas first, to call the Washington Gas emergency number. It's so important to them that when you purchase in our condo building, they give you a big a welcome package, and the front of the package, it says it in big red letters: if you smell gas, call Washington Gas. They will come immediately and shut off the gas line. So that is our direction, obviously, in our condo, but that number is really important. So I have that first page of our condo docs printed out, taped to my fridge, just in case there's ever a situation where I smell a gas leak, I know exactly who to call. Some other ones too, if you have kids in school, knowing the APS school or grandkids, if you have any pets, having like a vet's number, Animal Welfare League on there. And then of course, there's the general county questions as well, if you ever want to use any of those phone numbers.
Tania, we've got a question that's related to this.
Sure.
If a tree falls and hits your house or your roof and damages it, is that one where you should call 911?
Yes,
and,
yes.
What are the next steps after you do that?
Absolutely. So if a tree falls on your home, damages your roof, that is a situation. Absolutely. Because you're going to need trained professionals to come out there. It also potentially poses a risk, right? Because you don't know if there's any utilities. It could cause harm to the items in your home, but also physical harm to you. So that is a situation where you would call and you say, hey, I need immediate help. I need first responders to come out here. And specifically, when I talk about some of the other fallen branches, especially after a storm, you may notice that there's maybe a larger tree branch that's fallen on a path or maybe part of the road. Or another example too is sometimes people will notice like stop signs start moving. If you ever notice those, like any of the or a light is blinking versus, flashing versus solid. Those are situations where you can call the non-emergency line or use the report a problem. But in the case of a tree falling on your home, yes, please, your safety is always first. When in doubt, safety is first. And that's a situation where you would want to call 911. Absolutely. Okay, so other things to think about when you're writing about important phone numbers: personal contacts. I cannot stress this enough. I think this is one of the most important pieces to have. First, I recommend having 2 emergency points of contact. As I mentioned a little earlier, one of my emergency points of contact is my neighbor. He's also part of my buddy system. He's someone I trust. He lived across the hall from me, so he actually has an extra key to my house. So should I, for example, get stuck somewhere or my partner gets stuck somewhere, he can come in. I have 2 dogs. He can help take care of them, etc. So he's always been the in-town person that I use. I always suggest having an out-of-town contact. Does anyone guess why that might be a good thing to do? Anyone?
If there's a big emergency, your in-town contact may also be in trouble.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. The other thing to think about, and I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point living in the DMV, if there's ever a large scale event, whether it's a festival, a protest, a ball game, your cell phone connections might not be working, right? It might be difficult. So think if something happens when you're at a large scale event, the one I always give is like 4th of July. If you're out watching the fireworks and you try to send a text message or make a phone call, good luck. It's going to be very challenging because most of the phone lines are really strained and you probably won't have signal. So in that type of a situation, my household, my partner and I have an out-of-state point of contact. That specifically, it's my mother. So we would call her, we would text her. And she would be, once we were able to, she's kind of the one that would know, okay, they're accounted for, they're good. She'd be able to connect us should we not be able to contact each other too. So having an out-of-state one for multiple reasons is very helpful. Other phone numbers, I consider you writing down your doctor, if you have any specialists, your pharmacy, if you have any pets, your vet, if you have children in school, your daycare provider, or your school number. If you live in a multifamily building, your housing provider, your management company, your property management, and any other numbers you see important that are important for you. I've heard folks say, well, I want to write my car insurance company down. I say, great, write it down. Some folks say, oh, well, I have flood insurance or I have homeowners insurance. I want those numbers down. I say, even better. That's absolutely right. You should absolutely have those phone numbers down. This might seem silly, but I actually write down the phone numbers of the folks that I contact most, including my partner. Believe it or not, when an emergency happens, when adrenaline is rushing, you might forget your own phone number. And I've done that before. And so what that does, what writing them down specifically does 2 things. One, it allows you, gives you peace of mind that in the case of an emergency and your adrenaline is rushing, in case you're stressed, you won't panic or not know where to look them up. But also, should the power go out or should your cell phone battery die and you have to use a landline or you need to reference a phone number, you're not relying on technology that could possibly go down on you. So writing them down is really, really important. So as I said, step 1, knowing who to call and having those important phone numbers written down and being informed. Step 2 is making an emergency plan and practicing. An emergency plan is exactly as the name sounds, a plan for what you would do in an emergency. There's a few things to note about an emergency plan. It doesn't have to be super huge or nuanced, but we recommend including a few things in there. As I mentioned first, you want to write down what you would do. You don't just want to speak it out into the ether. You want to actually sit down with your household and think about, okay, what would we do if there's an emergency in the house? What would we do if there's an emergency in the neighborhood, in Arlington, outside the house? Think through these scenarios as we talked about knowing your risk, right? So think through the risk that potentially could exist for you and come up with a plan accordingly. Your plan should be written down. It should include things like a meeting place, right? So if my partner and I are in our household, we have to exit. Where do we exit? Who gets the dogs? If our front door is blocked, how do we get out of our unit? Additionally, if I'm at work, he's at work, how do we make sure that if we're separated, there's an emergency, we can't get back to Arlington, where do we meet? So that's really important, thinking through those different scenarios. I mentioned earlier the phone contacts and the phone numbers. Those are really important. I not only keep them on my fridge, but I keep a copy of them in my emergency plan. You can never go wrong. You're better safe than sorry to have those written down. And lastly, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, are personalized and special needs. And this is especially important if you have medical conditions or specific medical info. We'll go through that now. So you want to include your special needs in your emergency plan, specifically if you need transport. Let's say if we're under an evacuation order and you're used to a transportation service, you want to plan for what that transportation service might look like, how they could help you be evacuated. You want to plan how you'll have your assistive and medical devices with you during an evacuation. An example I always give is my mom uses an oxygen tank. So for her CPAP machine. So anytime that we talk about, she lives in a hurricane area and down in South Carolina. So one of the things that her and I always talk about, she has a little portable one that she takes with her when she travels. We make sure that that's always up and ready to go. She tests it every few months or so, just in case she needs to evacuate her home due to hurricane. She'll have that with her to help her breathe. Another thing that's really, really, really important, I can't stress this enough, copies of your important information, whether it's your Medicaid, your Medicare, your insurance cards, copies of your, for us, we keep copies of our marriage license, the title to our home, our insurance carrier, all of those important phone numbers. I keep records, my medical records. I have a copy of those with me as well as my partners. I also have our puppies. We have 2 dogs, as I mentioned, in our household. We keep a printed copy of those. And a really easy way to store them, I actually don't have a big bag with me right now, but I have a little one. Do you guys have those like Ziploc bags, right? They make those like gallon-sized Ziploc bags. Those are my favorite ones to use. It's so easy. You literally can make a copy of all of your forms, stick them in there and close it, and then put them in your emergency kit or put them somewhere safe. And that kind of helps keep them water resistant too. A lot of us probably have like very important places where we store our important information, but it doesn't hurt. Again, having a copy would not hurt, just in case you have to leave your home quickly and you forget something, or God forbid, something is damaged during a flood or fire or something along those lines. And then lastly, your medical needs. Someone mentioned earlier, extra medicine, having that on hand. So thinking through what are the specific needs of your household and how would you get those needs should there be an emergency and you have to move your house or be stuck in your house for a few days. So one of the things I like to always suggest to folks, this is a magnet, what you see on screen, the File of Life. You can find it online. I think it's, a couple bucks or so. What it includes is all of that important information we just talked about. It includes your address, your emergency contacts. It includes medical conditions you might have. It also includes medicines you take, etc. I'll be honest with you, this is great, but it doesn't need to be this fancy. You can simply just take a piece of paper, write important medical info on it, fill it out, and put it on your fridge. Can anyone guess why I suggest putting it on your fridge or somewhere visible?
So first responders can find it.
Exactly that. First responders are trained to look for things like medical information. They're trained to look for things that alert them to what to expect in the household. In my household, I keep talking about my pets. We have a sticker on our door that says there are 2 pets inside. I make sure that's updated. When we got our puppy this past year, one of the first things I did was get a new sticker and make sure that's updated because they will look for that. We also keep our important medical info on a 1-pager, very simple. And it doesn't need to be very detailed, but these are things that you want to think through should you be incapacitated or unable to speak that a first responder can look for. Both my partner and I have allergies to specific medicines. Those are really important. Yes, we keep that information all on our phone, but just in case we're unable to speak, we're in our home or we're separated from our phone, having that on the fridge is really important so we don't go into an allergic reaction should we be administered those medicines. So write it down, update it regularly, store it somewhere visible. Doesn't need to be fancy. It could be on a simple piece of paper. Okay, lastly, when it comes to making an emergency plan, practice, practice, practice. Plans are only good if you practice them. You don't need to practice every day, but you can, if you just take some time. I usually recommend twice a year when you're updating your emergency kit, make a little event out of it. Update your kit, check out your plan, make sure everything's current, do a little practice run, make sure that you can exit or you can do the things that are in your plan that you have written down. That's really important. And then also, if you have kids in the household, you want to make sure that you're practicing, or grandkids, whatever you want to practice with them as well. There's a colleague of mine that works for AWLA, and she always gives this example. I think it was really great. She was practicing with her husband and her children on what to do in their household if there was a fire. And her 6-year-old child at the time said, she said, well, where would you go if there's a fire? And she said, well, I'd go hide in the bathtub. And of course, as a parent, and as she was also a first responder, she was terrified. She said, oh my gosh, my child would go to the bathtub. Well, her child's logic was that water puts out fire. And so if she was in the bathtub, she would be safe from the fire, right? And so I got to applaud the child on her logic. That's pretty thoughtful. But obviously, as a parent, she was terrified. So it was really important to her every 6 months or so to say, okay, but this is why that's not safe. You know, if you smell smoke, this is where you need to go. So practicing really, really, really is extremely important. And then step 3, and you guys have already talked about this, but gather supplies and build an emergency kit. An emergency kit is essentially basic supplies to get you through an emergency. It includes food, water, medicine. It's all of your important information and items kept in one location or bag. And it's really important to have them all in one space in case you need to shelter in place. Alternatively, if you need to leave quickly, having everything in one place where you can easily grab it and leave is really helpful as well. They do save lives. So what would you include in an emergency kit or gathering supplies? First, food and water for you, your family, and if you have any pets. Ideally, you want to try to have enough for 2 to 3 days. When it comes to food, I always obviously recommend non-perishables. You don't want to put milk or fruit or something in there because that'll rot, but things that are high in protein that will kind of sustain you for a few days. So whether it's beans or maybe tuna, some meat, some vegetables, if you get anything that's canned, don't forget a can opener because you want to be able to open those. I always recommend things like protein bars as well, cereal bars, things along those lines. And same with water. Obviously, when you know a storm is coming, a lot of folks tend to fill up their bathtub just in case. But you can have bottled water. You can use life straws if you need it. I always just have my bottles and I just fill them up as I need before any sort of storm is coming. So just having some extra water. And then my vehicle, we always recommend that you keep an emergency kit in several locations. In my vehicle, I just keep a 6-pack of bottled water just in case I'm ever trapped in my vehicle. You guys mentioned flashlights. Those are great. You can have a crank flashlight, a regular flashlight with batteries. Just make sure you have the batteries. A first aid kit doesn't need to be fancy. Something that can clean a wound, some bandages, a battery or hand crank radio, some personal hygiene items. These are things like toothpaste, toothbrush, deodorant. I always say if you travel and you go to a hotel and they give you those little soaps and those little those little kits you can get in a hotel, I always take them with me and I'll throw them in my emergency kit. Moist towelettes or baby wipes. I apologize, my dog is barking. Extra contact lenses or if you wear contacts or glasses. Face masks, those are important, not just to protect you from any sort of disease, but also from debris, from smoke. Again, back to the summer, we had a lot of air quality issues. Face mask is great in those situations. Local maps, many of us rely on our cell phones, but again, should we not be able to use our cell phone? Having a printed map is a great way to go. Hand sanitizer, keep your hands clean. Whistle. Whistles are great if you're ever trapped somewhere. They will help signal. I apologize, guys. My dogs are barking. Hopefully you can't hear them too much. But they're loud and they'll signal for first responders to come find you. So I always keep a whistle. I keep one on my keychain for my vehicle. I keep one on my lanyard at work. I have one in my car. I have one in my emergency kit. I know they're kind of hard to find at stores, but I think you can probably find them online. Comfort items if you need it, like a book, a puzzle, something to keep you going should the power go out. Chargers, extra clothing, really important during the seasons. Right now we're in fall, about to go in winter. So about a month ago, back in September, I updated my emergency kit to include my fall materials, which includes more clothing, things like gloves, extra pair of socks, a warm hat. So those are things that I like to update. An extra blanket. I have like a fuzzy blanket I keep as well, just in case. A wrench, a pocket tool, some duct tape, trash bags, emergency blanket. Those are those aluminum looking things that are about this big and you put them on you and they actually trap your body heat. Hand warmers and just some extra cash. This is a lot. I know I just went through a very, very long list. This is an extensive list. I'm giving you everything that you could consider putting in there. At the end of the day, there's a few things that I really cannot stress enough when it comes to emergency kits. First, some supplies are better than none. So don't let this list overwhelm you. And it can be, if you have some of this material, great. If not, that's okay too. Maybe eventually you'll get there. But the last thing I want somebody to do is to look at this and say, well, that's a little too much. I'm not going to do it. The second is that they don't have to cost a lot of money. In fact, I'd venture to guess that most of you probably have these items already in your house. What I recommend doing is kind of go around, make a little scavenger hunt out of it, see what you have, challenge yourself to find everything within your own household. Last year, when we went and we did a presentation for a resiliency group with the county on MLK Day, I challenged myself to whatever I couldn't find in my bathroom and my kitchen to go to a dollar store and put things together. And I went to my local dollar store, and I think I paid $15 or something, and I was able to build out a small kit. So they don't need to be expensive. You can also, if you prefer, you can buy a completed kit. You can find them online. You can find them at your big box store. But I always tell folks, before you do that, check around your house, because you probably have most of it. And the last thing is, don't forget to update it regularly. I suggested twice a year because of this. I like to put more water and bug spray and sunscreen in my spring and summer kit. And then I like to put things that are more specific to the winter in my winter kit. Like I mentioned earlier, gloves, a woolly hat, an extra blanket, a sweater, etc. So thinking through the elements as well as you update your kit. And then one last thing to talk about, which I already kind of mentioned with the emergency kits, is that if you can, try to have one for places that you frequent. I have a pretty robust one in my household that looks a little something like this. I also have one for my pets. I keep one in my car. 2 days ago, I presented to the county on safety days about vehicle safety, and I challenged myself to pull my emergency kit out of the car. And I had things like jumper cables and extra water and snacks, and all of that was very helpful. And you might think like, okay, well, I mean, it's great, but how long will you be in your car? I just want to remind everyone, I don't know if everyone remembers, about 2 years ago, folks were trapped on I-95 for about 24 hours, just down the road in Stafford County. So in that type of a situation, having a few things like an emergency blanket to trap your body heat, granola bars or cereal bars, something that can keep you going, water, will go a long way, right? So think about where you frequent, whether it's your vehicle or your office. I also keep a small kit in my office in case I get stuck there overnight. They don't need to be huge, but having a few supplies there are really important as well. So some additional considerations for emergency planning. You don't want to forget about your pets if you have any, whether they're service or support animals or family pets. I talked about mine a lot, and they made a cameo as they were barking today. But building a small emergency kit, I have one for my pets that I keep in my household. Making sure your pet has collars and has tags. Having them microchipped. Some folks qualify through AWLA to get them microchipped for free, so feel free to check them out. Take pictures with your pet. That proves ownership. So if you're ever separated, a picture is great. Using that buddy system I talked about, I mentioned my neighbor being my point of contact. If I get stuck somewhere or something happens, he's going to be the one that'll come and take my dogs out if they need to be taken out. And then knowing where to find emergency pet housing. Once again, AWLA, or the Animal Welfare League of Arlington, does provide free emergency pet housing should you qualify. And then one other thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is cyber. Cyber is maybe not something you think of immediately when we talked about what could be an emergency in Arlington. I know we tended to gravitate towards natural disasters or man-made disasters, but cyber is something else that you should probably keep in the back of your mind. A few tips here for your phones, your computers, your Wi-Fi, etc. Have strong passwords. If you can, use two-factor authentication. That's when you go to sign into something and then they send you a notification to your phone or your email to confirm that code. Do those software updates. They're meant to keep your system up to date and refreshed. Back up those files. I also, as you guys can hear earlier, I'm a big advocate for anything that's important, any of those important documents, copy them. That's if you have them printed out, that's one of the safest things you can do, but you can also back them up and use like cloud services. Protect your home Wi-Fi. If you can, make sure it has a password. Be aware when you're using public Wi-Fi. And then the last two I really want to talk about, because I think in terms of who's targeted the most, it's considered older adults are the highest targeted population when it comes to the last two: suspicious links and spoof calls. So if you guys have ever gotten an email or a message on social media that says you've just won $1,000 or you qualify for some tax rebate, Or many, I don't know if you guys get them. I get these a lot too, where I will get a phone number that's calling that looks like a valid phone number. It doesn't say scam. It usually has the same area code as my cell phone. And when I answer, it's an automated service or it's a scam call. And they say things like, this is the IRS and we're seizing your home and we need you to give us $100 in iTunes gift cards or whatever the case may be. They're getting more and more creative when it comes to how to spoof calls and how to send suspicious links. If I'm being 100% transparent, the rise of AI, things like GPT, and all of these like technology advances have made it a lot easier. And so just be aware, you never want to give your personal information. If anyone's asking for your personal information over your cell phone or email, that's a problem. That should be a red flag. Anyone's asking you for money, that should be a red flag. So just kind of be cognizant of that, because what they're trying to do is get into your accounts and potentially like steal your identity or take money from you. All right, so that brings me towards the end of my presentation. To quickly review what we went over, we talked about how to identify an emergency. We talked about 3 steps that you can take today to make you more prepared at home: being informed and knowing who to call, making an emergency plan and practicing, gathering supplies, and building an emergency kit. And we talked a little bit about pets and cyber attacks, and that's it. That's it. Just doing these few simple steps will help you be prepared. So that brings me to the end. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Yeah, we've got one. She wrote that a lot of local evacuation plans that she's seen involve getting on roads that are routinely gridlocked, even without an emergency, and trying to flee. She said it seems almost as bad as staying at home and being devoured by zombies. So, what do we do about not ending up stuck in gridlock like the people you mentioned in Stafford?
Yeah, well, I think the first and foremost would be, if in the case, I lived in Arlington for almost, I'm not that long, maybe like, I think I'm about 10 years now. And during my time in Arlington, I don't think that I've ever been in an area that was been evacuated. But in that case, I would say listen to officials. That's really important. Going back to the whole listen to the guidance of officials. Evacuation plans are written by route and by zones. That's how emergency managers and first responders design them. So ideally, the way that they're written is to get zones out that are an immediate impact. So my best advice to you is to follow that guidance. And then my second advice is keep that kit in your car so that in case it does get difficult, it does get, there is a lot of traffic getting out, you have some essentials to keep you going. I also am a big fan of keeping my gas tank full. I know everyone operates different. It's about your, what, if you can, sometimes it's expensive to do that, but that helps you with several reasons. If you need to evacuate quickly, then you have a full tank of gas. In the wintertime, it helps your fuel line from freezing when the temperatures drop. So those are little things you can do, but I think the best advice would be keep a few essentials in your car and listen to the guidance. And if you feel comfortable, obviously, no one can force you from your home, but, follow that guidance accordingly.
And kind of the flip side of people being stuck in the snowstorm, somebody made the comment that it was much worse several years ago when we lost electricity for several days in the summer during the heat wave, and there was no easy way to cool off.
So I'll speak a little on that too. Obviously, temperatures are rising. It's not going to get any cooler. I think we've had probably our coolest summer the past year. So a few things. When we do lose power in any sort of situation, our team is working around the clock, in addition to our environmental services team, to make sure that we're connecting with Dominion, we're connecting with the providers to say, look, we really need to get resources to this community. They've lost power. How can we help? How can we make sure that we're getting their power restored as quickly as possible? Back to that whole having a few items in your emergency kit. I actually have a portable fan that I tend to keep that's like battery operated. I keep that in my emergency kit during the hot weather as well. I mentioned I also add more water. That's intentional, just in case. And then the other thing I do want to touch on, that's especially important during a heat wave. County buildings are always open. We always encourage encourage folks to go to libraries, community centers. We even, if the situation gets so severe, we'll set up cooling shelters, but those are going to be based on a lot of factors, to be honest with you. But we always encourage folks to go where they can get air conditioning, cool off during the day, at least for a little bit of time.
Gail has her hand up.
Sure.
Hi, Tanya. Thank you very much for this really great presentation. I have a question, and maybe and I'll email you later. We can talk. In 2009, our house was hit by a tornado, and we had trees coming in through our ceiling, walls, and windows. I called 911. I live by the parkway and the river, and I was transferred to the DC Emergency Management System, who wanted to know why in hell I was calling them. And I told them, I dial 911, that's what I get. They put me on hold for 20 minutes as they tried to connect me with Arlington. I finally got connected with Arlington. It was horrible. The house was destroyed. We were in it, and we started having looters as well. And I want to know, I tried to work with the Office of Emergency Management, and what could we do to solve this problem? And they told me they could not do anything. And that was 14 years ago. A couple of weeks ago, I called and left a message to see if there were any updates to this, because it's very scary. And I didn't get an answer, and wanted to see if there was any changes to this problem.
Sure. Well, first, I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm glad to hear that you were okay. That's always obviously terrifying. So the reason why that happens is the way that we have towers that are set up that catch the calls. And the tough part is we're only 23 square miles altogether. So especially if you live even near a border, for example, I used to live in Columbia Forest, which is almost the border of, I think, is it Fairfax? I think is the split line near Carlin Springs. So sometimes my calls would actually get sent there just because of my geolocation. The few things I can say is that this is, believe it or not, this is actually helpful to us, because that means that your call won't be missed. It's set up intentionally so that if Arlington can pick you up or DC can pick you up based on exactly how your cell phone or your landline pings at that moment. I will say they've gotten a little bit better. Again, it's tough when you're in a densely packed area that's so close. I'm happy to do a little bit more research and see specifically I do know there's been advances, because we talk about, and I say this because I've been working recently on some of the cell phone notifications that we're doing across the region. And I've been working with Fairfax, Loudoun, DC, Alexandria to look at those boundaries, because what we think about it from an emergency perspective is, if I need to notify people in Arlington, is it going to get into half of DC or vice versa, right? So I know those lines have gotten tighter and better. It also sounds like, unfortunately, it sounds like DC was also, you shouldn't have been, I'm sorry you were on hold for 20 minutes with DC. That's very frustrating. But I will ask about that. The other thing too, and I know this is not helpful because this to you having happened to you 14 years ago. The other thing that you can do is that non-emergency number. I told you guys it's picked up by first responders too. So what you could do is, if worst case, if let's say you get transferred to DC, you can hang up, call that non-emergency number, immediately say, I have an emergency, I need to speak to Arlington Police or Arlington County. That without there, you're getting a live, you're getting I think right now they have an answering service that turns you to a live person, but you're getting sent immediately to the Arlington system. I know that's not ideal because you want to be picked up by 911 in Arlington. I will be very candid with you. I just don't know if that's feasible, if I'm being completely honest, based on where you live and where the cell towers are. But that's always an option, to hang up, call the non-emergency, say, get me to 911. They will immediately transfer you to the other person sitting next to them.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to check if things have changed, because I really hope so. It was really frightening experience.
Okay, so it's 11 o'clock. I'm sorry, I've been losing my internet connection every once in a while, but I am back on now, but I don't want to not have everybody get their questions answered. So Gary, was there any other questions, Liz?
Well, somebody wanted to know if they could get a copy of your presentation. I've got it on my computer. I can send it to the office and anybody that wants it can just contact the ANV office and ask for a copy of it.
Sure.
The last one is somebody, she said she had a friend who was stuck on an overnight traffic jam on the Wilson Bridge. At some point she had to pee, and all she could find in the car was a 12-ounce can, and she had a 16-ounce problem. Do you have any kind of a suggestion for what to carry along to deal with that sort of thing in the future?
Honestly, that's going to be dependent on each person. That's tough. That is a tough situation. I usually have, I have like a little canister that I keep in there for things like, if I were to run out of gas or I need oil changes or something like that. You could use something like that. Ideally, I mean, I'm sorry that was a situation that's never fun. Yeah, I think that's going to be based on your comfort level too, honestly, if that's going to be of what you're comfortable having in your car and what you're comfortable doing. Some people might try to physically leave their car and then go to walk to a nearby place. Everyone's comfort level is different.
Okay, and I think our last comment here is one easy way to remember to check your go bag is do it when you change your clocks. So, spring and fall, update your go bag when you change your smoke detector batteries and change your clocks and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a brilliant idea. It also kind of aligns with those seasonal changes. So if you check your plan, you check your kit in the spring, that covers you for the warmer season in spring and summer. And then same in the fall. If you check it in the fall, you'll have items that you might need for colder weather as well. So, and then I will drop my email in the chat. So if anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. Gary, I'm also happy to give you the PDF version of this presentation, just that might be a little bit easier, and you're welcome to share it out. And otherwise, thank you so much for your time and for having me.
Thank you.
And Tanya, thank you. I mean, wow. I remember when I interviewed you, you brought us a lot of information, and I did put that link on the chat. So if people want to check that out. So anyway, I want to thank you for all of this really important information. And by the way, you can tune in next week on Coffee and Conversation. The topic is perch houses. And I'm just going to read this one sentence here. It says, Wing Pepper is the CEO and founder of Perch Houses, and Wing will talk about how perch houses serve as a model for solving the problems of housing affordability and social isolation for people 55 and older. So be sure and tune in next week. And until then, I thank you for joining Coffee and Conversation, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks again, Tanya, and I will stop the recording.
Yes.